Your neck cannot detect a stare, yet your brain can warn you before you consciously notice the evidence. You know the feeling before you know the reason. You are sitting on a train, looking down at your phone. Nothing touches you. Nothing calls your name. Yet the skin at the back of your neck tightens, and when you look up, someone across the carriage is staring straight at you. How did you know? But the real answer is far stranger. There may be no invisible beam leaving that stranger's eyes and no secret sensor hidden in your neck. Instead, your brain has been collecting scraps of evidence too small for conscious attention, mixing them with an ancient bias, and delivering its conclusion as a feeling. The conclusion arrives first. The explanation arrives later. So what exactly did your brain notice? To understand that feeling, you have to stop imagining perception as a camera. A camera waits for light and records whatever reaches it. Your brain does something more daring. It makes a prediction about what is happening, checks that prediction against the evidence, and quietly revises the story when the two do not match. What you experience as reality is partly sensation and partly your brain's best guess. So could the sensation of a stare be a guess that escaped into consciousness? Psychologists were asking that question long before brain scanners existed. In 1898, Edward Bradford Titchener wrote about students who insisted they could feel a gaze pressing against the backs of their necks. Some described tension. Others described tingling. Titchener tested people who claimed unusual sensitivity or unusual power to make others turn, but his laboratory results were consistently negative. If no mysterious signal was crossing the room, why did the experience feel so physical? Titchener noticed that attention changes the body. Focus intensely on your knee and sensations that were always there begin to emerge. Pressure from clothing, a tiny itch, the pull of a muscle, perhaps even an urge to move. Focus on your unprotected back in a crowded room, and the same process can turn ordinary noise inside your body into an alarm. The feeling is real. The story attached to it may not be. But why does the story so often seem to come true? In 1913, Stanford psychologist John Edgar Hoover put the claim through another controlled test. 10 students each made 100 judgments about whether an experimenter positioned behind was staring during a timed interval. Across 1,000 attempts, they were correct 50.2% of the time, almost exactly what chance predicted. That result did not mean anyone had invented the original feeling. It meant the feeling could not reliably identify a hidden gaze under controlled conditions. So why does personal memory insist otherwise? Because memory does not keep a fair score. Imagine turning around 20 times during a week. 19 times, nobody is looking, and the moment evaporates before dinner. Once, your eyes meet another pair across a room, your heart jumps, and the scene earns a permanent place in your private evidence file. One hit becomes a story, while 19 misses become nothing. So which result will your memory use the next time your neck begins to prickle? There is another trick hidden inside that successful hit. The person across the room may not have been staring until you moved. Your sudden turn produces motion. Motion captures attention, and their eyes snap toward you just as yours reach them. Now both minds experience simultaneous eye contact. It feels as if their stare caused your turn, even though your turn may have caused their stare. How often does cause and effect reverse itself in the space of a single glance? Yet chance and memory are only part of the answer. Most real rooms are not sealed laboratories. Your peripheral vision catches a pale oval between shoulders, a shift in head angle, or a figure that suddenly becomes still. Your hearing catches fabric moving, footsteps stopping, or a conversation changing rhythm. None of these clues needs to become a conscious thought before it changes your level of alertness. So what happens when the brain combines them? It builds a verdict from fragments. Peripheral vision is poor at fine detail, but it is useful for detecting contrast and movement beyond the narrow point you are staring at. In experiments by perception researcher Jack Loomis and colleagues, people could judge head orientation far into the edge of vision, while precise eye direction was reliable only close to the point they were looking at. The corner of your eye does not secretly read tiny pupils. It notices a person, a head angle, or a movement, and gives you a reason to turn. By the time central vision checks the eyes, could the investigation already be nearly finished? The geometry of a gaze is also less precise than it feels. There is not one razor-thin line that your brain classifies as eye contact and everything else as a miss. Instead, you have what researchers call a cone of direct gaze, meaning a range of eye positions that all feel as though they point toward you. The farther away a face is, the blurrier it becomes, and the less certain the evidence gets. Under that uncertainty, your brain does not remain neutral. Which direction does it choose? In 2013, vision researchers Isabel Marescal, Andrew Calder, and Colin Clifford asked participants to judge the gaze of computer-generated faces under different levels of visual uncertainty. Their results fit a Bayesian model, a plain English way of saying that the brain mixes current evidence with an expectation formed before the evidence arrives. When the gaze signal became noisy, people were biased toward judging the eyes as directed at them. Your perceptual system appears to carry a prior expectation that an uncertain gaze may be aimed your way. Why would your brain prefer that particular mistake? One plausible reason is that the two possible errors can carry different costs. Mistaking an averted gaze for a direct one can create a brief false alarm. Mistaking a direct gaze for an averted one can mean missing a threat, a warning, an invitation, or a chance to coordinate with another person. A nervous system does not need perfect accuracy to be useful. If one kind of mistake often costs less than the other, a bias toward caution would make sense. But that logic is an evolutionary hypothesis rather than a recovered fact. When evidence is incomplete, which mistake would a protective system rather make? That does not prove a single evolutionary story. Human eyes may have changed for several reasons, and researchers still debate the details. But the eyes you see every day are unusually easy to read because a dark iris moves across a visible white surface. That contrast makes gaze direction available from small movements alone. Why would a species become so readable? Michael Tomasello, Brian Hare, Hagen Lehman, and Josep Call explored one answer in 2007. An experimenter looked toward the ceiling using only the eyes, only the head, both, or neither, while great apes and human infants watched. The apes followed the direction of the head most strongly. The infants relied almost entirely on the eyes. The researchers called their idea the cooperative eye hypothesis. Visible, readable eyes may help people share attention and work together, but what happens when the same social signal carries danger instead of cooperation? Direct gaze is wonderfully ambiguous. It can mean help. It can mean attraction. It can mean that someone is about to speak, challenge, accuse, or attack. An averted gaze tells you where another person's attention has gone, while a direct gaze tells you that their attention has reached you. Is there any social message more personal than that? Your attention responds even when a gaze offers no useful information. In a famous 1998 experiment, Chris Friesen and Alan Kingstone showed participants a simple drawn face whose eyes looked left or right before a target appeared. The eye direction did not predict where the target would be, and participants knew it. Even so, they reacted faster when the target appeared where the face had looked. If your attention follows another person's eyes against your instructions, how voluntary is the process? Direct gaze can also win the race into awareness. In experiments led by Timo Stein with Atsushi Senju and Marius Pilen, one eye was shown a face while the other was flooded with a strong changing pattern that temporarily kept the face outside conscious sight. Faces looking directly at the viewer broke through that visual suppression faster than faces looking away. The participants were not simply choosing to prioritize eye contact because they did not consciously see the face at first. What noticed the gaze before the conscious mind did? Fast processing does not belong to one magical brain button. A network of regions helps analyze faces, attention, body state, and social meaning. The amygdala is part of that network, but calling it a fear center is too simple. It also helps decide what is important enough to prioritize. In a study by Wataru Sato and colleagues, electrodes placed for medical reasons recorded activity directly from the amygdala while 6 patients viewed images of eyes. The response rose rapidly and peaked around 0.2 of a second. So how much can happen before you can explain what you saw? This speed creates a peculiar order of events. First comes a shift in attention. Then comes a change in the body, a tightened shoulder, a held breath, a quickened pulse, or that famous sensation at the neck. Only after that does the verbal part of your mind arrive and ask for a cause. When the clearest possibility is another person's attention, the story writes itself. Could a bodily warning feel supernatural simply because its evidence remained unconscious? That is the counterintuitive truth. You can feel someone staring at you, but the feeling is not a remote measurement of another person's eyes. It is your experience of your own detection system changing state. Sometimes that change was triggered by genuine visual or auditory clues. Sometimes it was triggered by expectation, uncertainty, or an ordinary sensation that attention amplified. Why would all of those different causes feel exactly the same? Because consciousness receives the alarm, not the laboratory report. It does not show you a list containing peripheral face shape, tiny sound, uncertain gaze angle, prior expectation, and recent memory. It gives you tension. It gives you urgency. It gives you the thought that someone is there. If a fast warning had to wait for a written explanation, would it still be fast enough to matter? The system becomes easier to notice in darkness, silence, and unfamiliar places. Evidence gets weaker there, but uncertainty gets stronger. A coat on a chair becomes a crouched figure, a reflection becomes an eye, and an ordinary creak becomes deliberate movement because your brain must interpret incomplete information before safety is guaranteed. The same bias can appear in a crowded party, where several ambiguous faces seem directed toward you at once. When certainty disappears, does your brain become less watchful or more? Expectation can widen the effect. If you already feel judged, exposed, or unsafe, an ambiguous glance has more reason to be classified as direct. Some studies have reported a wider cone of direct gaze in socially anxious groups, although the finding has not appeared consistently across every study. The careful conclusion is not that anxiety reveals hidden watchers or that every anxious feeling is false. It is that the boundary between looking near you and looking at you can move with context. So how many apparent stares are partly shaped by the state you carried into the room? Modern life keeps pressing that ancient button. A dark phone camera, a glowing doorbell lens, an open laptop, or a silent profile icon can make you monitor your posture and expression even when you cannot tell whether anyone is watching in that moment. The possible observer becomes enough. Your attention turns inward, ordinary body sensations grow louder, and uncertainty supplies the missing face. Has the old fear of exposed skin at the back simply become the new fear of an unseen audience behind a screen? The next time the feeling arrives, you do not have to dismiss it. Pause. Notice what your eyes may have caught at the edge, what your ears registered, what changed in the room, and what expectation was already active. Then remember the forgotten misses and the glance your own movement may be about to create. Is the feeling proof of a watcher or evidence that your brain is searching for one? You are not sensing a beam. You are sensing a prediction. It is fast, protective, biased, and often astonishingly well-informed. What else could feel so certain before it can explain itself? Sometimes you will turn and meet a pair of eyes. Sometimes you will turn and find an empty room. Either way, you know the feeling before you know the reason, because your brain has been gathering the reason all along. Subscribe to OldBrain to uncover the ancient machinery still shaping what you feel, fear, and notice.